Welcome to Lecture 5 for the Pentateuch. This lecture will be our fifth and final part through the book of Genesis. Roman numeral 14. Genesis chapters 37 through 50 highlight the son of Jacob, Joseph. Letter A. Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. Number 1. Joseph dreams that he will reign over his family. Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob, so much so that Jacob even made him a special coat. At the age of 17, Joseph had two dreams. One was that his brother's sheaves of wheat made obeisance to his sheaf of wheat. The other was that the 11 stars, the sun, and the moon made obeisance to Joseph. While Joseph's brothers mocked him for these dreams, Jacob kept the dreams in his thoughts. Number 2. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. One day, when the brothers were supposed to be watching the flocks, Jacob sent Joseph to get a report of what they were doing. When Joseph got close to Shechem, where they were supposed to be, a stranger found him and told him that they went to Dothan. As soon as the brothers saw him coming, they conspired to kill him. Thankfully, Reuben convinces them not to kill him, but to throw him into a pit instead. They did this after taking his coat from off of him, and then decided to sell him to the Ishmaelites, which was Judah's idea, for 20 pieces of silver. In order to cover this up, they killed a goat, put the blood on Joseph's torn coat, and presented it to Jacob as if he had died by a wild beast. This caused Jacob to mourn for Joseph and refuse consolation. The Midianites, which were Ishmaelites, are then recorded as selling Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of his guard in Egypt. Letter B. Judah impregnates his daughter-in-law Tamar. Judah had children, but unfortunately one of his sons, the firstborn, died by God's hand because of his wickedness, and this left his wife Tamar childless. Judah then instructed Onan, Er's brother, to marry Tamar to have a son with her. But Onan refused to allow his seed to enter Tamar, since it would not be his own son. So this motivated God to kill Onan. Tamar then devised a plan to have Judah impregnate her by covering herself with a veil and appearing like a harlot. Judah sees her, sleeps with her, and then 3 months later goes back to pay the harlot, but discovers that it was actually his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Well, Judah wants to kill her by fire for this act, but she convinces him not to because of his hypocrisy. She then ends up having twins, Pharez and Zara. Interestingly, Zara puts his hand out of the womb first, and they tie a scarlet thread around it. However, he pulls his hand back, and Pharez completely comes out first. Pharez is actually listed in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. Letter C. Potiphar's wife frames Joseph. On account of God being with Joseph and blessing all that he did, Potiphar recognized this and made him overseer of his house and all he had, thereby blessing Potiphar's house too. Well, apparently there are a lot of attractive people in this family because Joseph is said to be a goodly person, which in the Hebrew literally means handsome in form and appearance. This caused Potiphar's wife to tempt him to sleep with her, but Joseph refused on account of how good Potiphar had been to him and all that he was entrusted with. According to verse 10, this tempting of Joseph by Potiphar's wife happened day after day, until one day she tried to force him to have sex with her since the house was empty. But Joseph refused, ran away, and left his garment. And then this garment was used as evidence by her that Joseph tried to rape her. This testimony of Potiphar's wife caused Potiphar's wrath to be kindled against Joseph, so he put him in prison. Ironically, while in the king's prison, the Lord continued to bless all that Joseph did. So, the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners with complete trust. Letter D. Joseph interprets the butler and baker's dreams. While overseeing the prison, Joseph noticed two men who had a sad countenance. When they explained that it was because of a dream they had that night, Joseph says that interpretations of dreams belong to God, so they should tell him. The butler's dream was that he saw a vine with 3 branches and lots of grapes, which he took and pressed into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph said the interpretation of this dream was that in 3 days he would be delivered out of prison to be Pharaoh's cupbearer. After this interpretation is given, Joseph then asked the butler to remember him so he could get out of prison since he was falsely charged. The baker's dream was that he had 3 baskets on his head with white bread, and the birds came and ate the bread out of the baskets from off his head. Joseph said the interpretation of this dream was that in 3 days, Pharaoh would hang him on a tree, and the birds would eat his flesh from off him. All of these interpretations were fulfilled, but the chief butler still forgot about Joseph. Letter E. Joseph interprets the Pharaoh's dreams. 2 years after the butler had been released, Pharaoh himself had 2 dreams that not even his wise men and magicians could interpret. Upon this realization, the chief butler told Pharaoh of how Joseph rightly interpreted his and the baker's dreams. Joseph was then hastily cleaned up and brought to Pharaoh's house to be told the dreams for interpretation. The Pharaoh's dreams were that he saw 7 good cows come out of the river, and then 7 ill cows come up after them and eat them. He then saw 7 good stalks of grain, followed by 7 withered stalks of grain that came up and ate the good stalks. Joseph said the interpretation was that there would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph then tells Pharaoh to set a wise man in charge of collecting 1/5 of all grain to be stored up for the famine. This was basically a 20% tax on all crops. Pharaoh declared that there is none wiser than Joseph, so he set him as second in command of Egypt, and then had a parade in his honor where he wore the Pharaoh's ring and kingly apparel while riding in the chariot right behind Pharaoh. Pharaoh even changed his name to Zaphnath-Paaneah, meaning one who reveals mysteries, and he gives him Asenath to be his wife. According to verse 46, this all happens when Joseph was 30 years of age. They both then have 2 sons, Manasseh, meaning making forgetful, symbolizing how the Lord allowed him to forget all the bad that had happened to him, and Ephraim, meaning fruitfulness, symbolizing the obvious. Letter F. Joseph's brothers, except Benjamin, come to Egypt. On account of the famine in the land, Jacob sent all the brothers, except Benjamin, to Egypt to get grain. He said he would not send Benjamin because he didn't want anything to happen to him. Once they got to Egypt and bowed themselves to Joseph, Joseph recognized his brothers and accused them of being spies and spoke harshly to them. The brothers protested that they were 12 sons of one man, whom one son was dead and the other was at home with their father. Joseph continued to accuse them of spying and bound them in prison for 3 days. Afterward, He said he would let them go, but keep Simeon to be released only when they brought the other brother back with them. Reuben is even recorded as saying that this is because of what they did to Joseph, something which he says he warned them not to do. They all then returned to their father Jacob with full grain and even all the money they had, which they took to be God's way of punishing them even more. When they got to Jacob and told him all that happened, Jacob refused to let Benjamin go because he said if Benjamin died, then Jacob would go to the grave. Reuben even offered his 2 sons' lives if they did not return with Benjamin, but Jacob refused. Letter G. Joseph's brothers, including Benjamin, returned to Egypt. After the grain they had bought from Egypt ran out, Jacob, or Israel, reluctantly told his sons to go again to Egypt, and this time they could bring Benjamin and double the money to pay Egypt back for the first time. Upon their arrival in Egypt, Joseph had a noon meal made ready for them and had them brought to his house. The brothers assume they are in trouble because they still had the money from the first time. Joseph then had them seated according to age and served them all food, with Benjamin receiving 5 times as much as the others. Letter H. Joseph tests his brothers. Before sending the brothers off, Joseph had a silver cup put in Benjamin's bag. He then allowed the brothers to travel a little way out of the city and sent men to overtake them and search for the cup. The penalty was that whosever bag it was found in would be Joseph's servant. Once the cup was found in Benjamin's bag, the brothers tore their clothes and returned to the city to Joseph's house. There, Judah begged Joseph to let him be his servant instead of Benjamin because of how it would affect their father. Poetically, it was Judah's idea to sell Joseph into slavery in the first place. Letter I. Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers. Unable to constrain himself anymore, Joseph sent his servants out of the room and then revealed that he was Joseph, their brother whom they sold into Egypt. They were literally speechless, but Joseph comforts them that God meant everything for good to preserve life on the earth. Joseph then hugged and kissed them all, and the fame of what had transpired got to Pharaoh, so he told them to bring their father and entire family to Egypt to enjoy all they had. He even sent them away with wagons for their things and changes of clothing. Benjamin got 5 changes of clothing and 300 pieces of silver. When the brothers returned to Jacob and told him all that happened, Jacob was revived in his soul and said that they should go see Joseph before he died. Letter J. Joseph reunites with his father, Israel. When they got to Egypt, Joseph was reunited with his father and instructed Jacob, or Israel, to tell Pharaoh that they were cattlemen so that they could get the land of Goshen. And because of that, letter K, Jacob's family dwells in Goshen. Joseph and 5 of his brothers met with Pharaoh and asked if they could live in the land of Egypt since the famine in Canaan was so bad. Pharaoh agreed and said that they could live in the best land for shepherding, the land of Goshen. Pharaoh even said that they could oversee all of Pharaoh's own cattle. Jacob, 130 at this time, was then brought to Pharaoh and blessed him. After this, the famine became so bad that the people of Egypt ran out of money, so they had to buy grain with their livestock. Then, when all of their livestock was gone, they sold their land to Pharaoh for grain, except for the Egyptian priest who had land and provisions from Pharaoh himself. This is when Joseph instituted another 20% tax on all crops payable to Pharaoh. In letter L, Israel blesses Ephraim and Manasseh. At the age of 147, 17 years after being brought into Egypt, Jacob was near death. So Joseph brought his two sons, Manasseh the eldest and Ephraim the youngest, to see Jacob. Jacob was ecstatic at the fact that he never thought he would see Joseph again, but God allowed him to even see Joseph's seed as well. Jacob then blessed Joseph and placed his right hand upon Ephraim, the youngest, and his left hand upon Manasseh, the eldest. Seeing this, Joseph attempted to move Jacob's hand since Manasseh was the elder of the two. But Jacob refused and declared that both would be great nations, but Ephraim would be greater. Letter M. Jacob gives prophecies to his sons and dies. Jacob called his sons together to tell them what will happen to them. He says that Reuben was unstable and would not excel. He then declares that Simeon and Levi were instruments of cruelty, and because of their anger, they will be divided and scattered in Israel. Judah is said to be a praise to the people and a weapon against his enemies. Jesus is even prophesied through Judah's line. Jacob then says that Joseph will be fruitful and Benjamin will be like a ravenous wolf that will devour its prey. Finally, Jacob then dies and he is buried in the cave of Machpelah. And lastly, letter N, Joseph dies. After Jacob died, Joseph had him embalmed and mourned for 40 days. He then asked leave of Pharaoh to go bury his father. Afterward, Joseph's brothers feared that Joseph would repay them evil for what they had done. So they lied and told Joseph that Jacob said to forgive them. Joseph's reply was that he was not in God's place, and even though they meant what they did for evil, God meant it for good. Joseph then died at the age of 110 years old, even being able to see Ephraim's great-grandchildren. That brings us to the end of Lecture 5 and our final part of our study through the book of Genesis.